I think that movies depend so much on rhythm. They are so close to music, a movie is. Closer to music than a drama of the theater. That if the sound and the rhythm of the sound, above all the rhythm, is wrong, no image can save it. It's not only what you say, but the rhythm and speed of all the voices in a scene. So I often, when I direct, turn my back on the scene.
Hello everyone and welcome to Tales of Cinema, the podcast episode 2.
Oh, it's alive! It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! Oh, in the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
I hope everyone's alright and I hope you enjoyed the first episode. Today is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to be talking about only one film and I'm going to try to keep it a bit shorter. I just wanted to say a few words first about the podcast. First of all, thanks for having listened to the first one and commented, and I had great returns from the first one. I'm very happy about that. But while researching for this particular podcast, I realized a few things about reviewing films. So I was just watching a few videos, a few reviews of the Funhouse, just as curiosity, see what people were seeing in that film, or if they had come to the same conclusions as me. Some did, some didn't. The main point here was that most of the time people who are reviewing films, who are talking about films, are talking simply about the story. They're talking about the actors, they're talking about the characters, what they do, how stupid what they do is, or the flaws in the screenplay, that kind of stuff. It's important to keep in mind that the specificity of cinema isn't in the story. Obviously, a good story is important, but a story isn't everything. And I'm a little bit sad, really, to see all those people taking time just to, sometimes or a lot of the time, just to trash a film. Simply talking about the story and ignoring everything else that makes the specificity of a film, the specificity of cinema. What I mean by that is how you work the film, how you compose the film. So what type of angles you use, the composition of your frames, the camera movements that you do or not, the different lenses that you use, the colors, the placement of the actors, the editing is really, really important as well, the rhythm of the film. All those things make the specificity of cinema, and you can't, I'm sorry for those guys, some of them do a good job, but you can't talk about a film, you can't give a good, honest review if you don't talk about those things. If you only talk about the story, how it unfolds, how you think it's written stupidly or that it doesn't fit into reality, bear in mind that none of the films are real. It's like what Hitchcock used to say, it's 24 lies a second. A film is a lie. It's not supposed to take place in reality. It's supposed to take place in the reality of that particular story. So the logic is different than the logic in reality. And if you're trying to review a film based on the logic of our reality, then you do something clearly wrong, because each film is set in the logic of its creator. And the role of a reviewer should be to try to understand how a new film or how a specific film fits into the logic of this particular creator, this particular director or writer. That's really important to keep in mind when you're trying to do, and this goes for any other medium, to be honest. This goes for comic books, this goes for novels, this goes for video games, paintings, this goes for everything else. Any cultural medium has its specificity. Story is a common thing usually. And as we have talked about in the previous podcast, Joseph Campbell showed how a good story is important also, or specific codes are important to incorporate into your story. But you have to think your story in terms of the specificity of the medium you are investing. And when it comes to cinema, you have to understand what makes it cinema, what makes a film, and how the story is handled through those tools. I hope I'm making myself clear, and in a way that's what I'm trying to do with the written blog, in a more in-depth way, in a more academic way. But I also want to do it with the podcast to talk about the specificity of cinema, why those films are worth a watch, why they are fun through the specificity of the medium cinema. That's important to start with. So without further ado, let's start with episode 2.
Joey! Just for that, I'm not taking you to the carnival on Saturday. And while I'm there tonight, you think about this. I'm gonna get even with you. You're not gonna know when or where, but I'm gonna get you so bad you're never gonna forget it. Never!
Today we're talking about The Funhouse, directed by Tobe Hooper in 1981. Just to present the director Tobe Hooper, he was an American director born in 1943 and sadly passed away in 2017. A very interesting career. He released his first feature film in 1969 titled Eggshells, which was co-written by Kim Henkel. They will collaborate again on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, which is probably the most known film by Tobe Hooper. Then Eaten Alive in 1977, and The Funhouse in 1981. So that's the film we're going to focus on. So The Funhouse was his first big studio project. And following that up, Spielberg will offer him a couple of projects, and they will eventually work on Poltergeist. Well, there's a few things about this film, notably about the creative credit on the film. I'm not going to talk about that. To me, yes, it's a film that you can see the heavy hand of Spielberg on it, but it's also clearly a Tobe Hooper film. Then it goes a bit sideways, and a 3-film deal with the Cannon Group. That's quite funny. We talked about the Cannon Group in the previous podcast, and here they come again. So at that time, Tobe Hooper starts using coke a lot, and he's completely coked out of his mind when he does those 3 films for Cannon Group. So Life Force, Invaders from Mars, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. Have a go at those films and remember that he was coked out of his mind. He did a couple more things afterwards, but his career didn't go very well. He did Spontaneous Combustion in 1990, Body Bags with John Carpenter in 1993, Crocodile in 2000, quite fun, and Mortuary in 2005. He did a bit of work for television as well, notably an adaptation of Salem's Lot of Stephen King in 1979. He worked on Tales from the Crypt, Dark Skies, or Masters of Horror, to name a few. Just a bit more about Tobe Hooper. He works with film with celluloid. He's a cross between independent cinema and grittier horror, a horror that is typical of the 1970s, and he also quite often portrays dysfunctional families, and he has a dark humor, dark comedy world that is usually present in many, if not all, of his films. Now we can move on to The Funhouse. So it was directed in 1981, and as I mentioned, is the first big studio project by Tobe Hooper. And it shows there is a clear difference between, let's say, Texas Chainsaw Massacre and this film in terms of camera work. It's a continuation, but you can tell he had more budget. So about the story, it's about 4 American youngsters going to a carnival at the beginning of the film. The main character, Amy, played by Elizabeth Berridge, lies to her parents and says she's going to the movies, but obviously she's going to have fun at the carnival on a double date kind of thing. They decide to have fun, a little bit of fun around, and then to go in the fun house and stay there after the closing of the carnival to enjoy themselves. And that's where things will go wrong. So it comes at the beginning of the slasher wave in the 80s, a few years after Halloween by John Carpenter, and before the whole Friday the 13th, before the whole craze for slasher really started. Why I'm talking about this film is because in its story it incorporates homage slash comment of the whole horror genre within it. And that makes it quite unique at the time because it comes almost before the whole slasher craze of the 80s. And it's an ancestor, we could say, or a precedent to Scream in that regard. In a way, we could say it's one of the earliest examples of a postmodern horror film, really. And that makes it more than 10 years before Scream, one of the earliest examples of a horror film that plays so much with the codes, with several layers upon layers of comment and of different realities throughout the film. That's very surprising, given that the film was released and made before a lot of the franchises of the horror franchises that we now know and that were also commented in Scream. And this from the start of the film. It starts with a double homage, or triple homage actually. It's a long tracking shot, a POV shot, exactly like Halloween, which only was released a few years before. Someone's put a mask on, and in that room it's filled up with reproductions of Universal monsters. So you've got masks and sculptures and posters and all that stuff on the walls. It gives you a slight hint of what's to come. It's more going to be a homage to Universal monsters. But Tobe Hooper is very aware of what's happening in the horror genre and at that time, and that's why he shoots his opening scene that way. Give you hints of what the film is going to be about, but at the same time acknowledging the current wave of horror films by doing that homage to Halloween. That long tracking shot, which is only one shot, exactly like in Halloween, and in the shower, while Elizabeth Berridge's character Amy is taking a shower, and the person that we are following with that tracking shot tries to stab Amy, and it's only revealed that the knife is a fake. So that's a homage to Psycho. So the opening scene contains already 3 layers. We have a homage to Psycho, a homage to Halloween, and a homage to Universal monsters. That's going to be the mix of the whole film. And that gives you the whole tone of the film, what it's going to be about, straight away, without any dialogue, without anything. It's just pure cinematography, and that's just a really good start for the film. It's also a homage to Freaks by Todd Browning, while giving his own variation, his own version of it.
Feels good, huh? Relax. Just relax. Oh, too late, huh? Well, nothing to be ashamed of. It happens to the best of us. Felt good, huh? Well, of course it felt good. You just relax.
So there's plenty of playing around with the codes, like this moment after the first murder, where one of the characters, Richie, is saying, "Oh, wait, I have to make sure she's dead." And as an audience, you've seen that so many times that you think, no, don't go that way. It's incredibly stupid to go that way. You're gonna get killed. And actually, the scene plays out really quickly. He doesn't get killed. Nothing happens. Or it seems that nothing happens, but something else happened in that scene. He stole the money, triggering the violence of the second part of the film. And it's constantly things like these where you think it's going to go one way, eventually it will go that way, but it's taking a little twist. It's playing around with the code. So as usual with Tobe Hooper, the main character Amy has a dysfunctional family. We are presented with her little shit of a brother who seems to be constantly playing around and doing pranks. Her mother seems to be an alcoholic, stuck on the TV. Her father seems to be a bit absent. She lies at the beginning of the film. They don't seem to really care. It will be later revealed that the main villains of the film are also part of a dysfunctional family. So that's completely in line with what Tobe Hooper is used to do. There is also another recurring element in Tobe Hooper's career is the question, who are the real monsters? That's something that he's constantly exploring in his films, and particularly in Eaten Alive or the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and in this Funhouse as well, because those films contain physically monsters. You can tell that they are monsters. They perform atrocious acts, but are they the real monsters, or the humans around them are the real monsters? That's the question, the big question that seems to obsess Tobe Hooper all across his career, but particularly at the beginning of his career. But you can find these elements in many of his films later on.
You really did it this time, didn't you? You killed one of the family. Damn. I told you, didn't I tell you? I don't care what you do. It's a dirty business with them locals. But I don't want you doing nothing with our kind. You understand me? Damn you. Should have wrung your ugly neck the day you was born and been done with it.
If you're just watching the film purely for the story, it's gonna be, or the first layer of the story, it's gonna be very, it's a typical slasher. There's no real surprises in here in terms of purely the story developments. But if you really pay attention to the film, it's very different to most of the horror films that we're gonna get in the 80s and subsequently, and very different to the whole slasher genre that will be spawned afterwards, or that was already spawning at the time. It's very carefully framed, very elegant. Tobe Hooper takes his time to set up everything, set up the location, set up the characters, set up his dark humor. And this from the opening credits, they are very, very creepy. They are all still shots, loads of camera movements, loads of tracking shots, loads of dolly shots to show you the extent of the huge location that is the carnival, and to show you the characters trapped inside it. Really good work on the lights in the film as well, and in terms of quality, in terms of technicality, a lot superior to many, or if not most, of the slashers from the 80s. So as I mentioned before, it's a film that has many, many layers. It's a carnival, so everything is fake in there, everything is for show, but the real show starts when everyone leaves and everything is turned off. And the scene where the whole carnival is being turned off, there's a long dolly shot starting from the funhouse. You see the little kid, Emmy's brother, who actually followed them up in the carnival. He kind of represents the audience, actually. And you see that long dolly shot starting from the funhouse, including the kid in the frame, and then going up in the sky and revealing the whole carnival being turned off. And that's a really powerful idea. The big monster himself has all those layers thing, because this actor portraying his character of a monster with makeup effect, with this mask on, is also wearing a mask, a monster mask, a Frankenstein's creature mask, to hide from society and from normal people. The special effects, the makeup effects were actually done by Rob Bottin and Rick Baker. Excellent work on this film. The film constantly plays on those different layers. In that regard, there's constantly a game of the different levels of audience. We're constantly watching characters watching something else. And sometimes those characters are even watching people watching something. A good example is the scene where they want to go see the strippers. They cannot enter within the tent because they are too young. So what they do is they go behind the tent and create a little hole to be able to see. So what happens there is, bear in mind that the kid is following them. What happens there is that we are watching a horror film in which a kid is following a group of young people, watching them, who are themselves watching the strippers through a little hole. So you constantly have those little levels of audience, those layers. It's the same for the inaugural murder, where we are watching those kids watching the murder. Once the main characters are in the funhouse, you also realize that the carnival itself and the funhouse itself is a character. Even though the carnival is turned off, the funhouse seems to start living by itself almost. Watching the young people getting killed and not taking it seriously, while the situation itself is actually quite serious. It looks like the funhouse is the director, is Tobe Hooper himself, laughing at what's happening. The murders themselves are carefully staged using the funhouse features, and that's a real pleasure to see. You have a play with the composition of the frames, including the size of the sets and the play on the lights, on the red lights and green lights, and the choreography of the murders. It's really, really well done. I particularly like the end of the film. It ends on a dolly shot, similar to what we've seen earlier with a kid, except this time it gives an apocalyptic feeling. It's a very insidious, very nasty end, because basically the world is changing. The world is not like it was when Freaks was being done, but the Freaks still exist and they're still there. It's a very subversive ending.
What'd you do with the other girl?
Oh, I expect by now he's just finishing up with her. We'll just wait here till he gets back. Oh, my. That is a gruesome sight.
Let's resume quickly why I think this Funhouse is still worth a watch nowadays. It's very different from the slashers from the 80s that you would get. It seems in appearance to be the same thing, but it's actually way more elegant. Visually, it's really well composed, really well framed. There's a heavy work on the editing, on the lighting of the film, and it's a comment as well as a homage on the whole horror legacy up to that time. That's what makes it interesting. And again, this question about what is fake, what is real, that's a central point in the film. Well, it's time to wrap up. I hope you enjoyed this interpretation of the film, which I think is often overlooked. People tend to focus on the first layer of the story and tend to miss the comment of the whole genre. Pay attention to all those things while watching the film, and you're going to take out so much more of the film than if you were watching it just as a pure slasher from the 80s. It's way more than this, and it fits very well into Tobe Hooper's career, really. You can find the film very easily. There's an outstanding edition on Blu-ray released by Arrow Video here in the UK. You can find it easily on Amazon or on the Arrow Video website. Outstanding copy, outstanding edition. Go for this one if I had one to recommend. Now it's time to say goodbye, and I will be back very soon for another episode of Tales of Cinema, the podcast. Bye, everyone.